Jessica Taylor is an AI and cognitive science influenced philosopher working on a range of areas like social epistemology, decision theory, and philosophy of mind, to name a few. She's currently a researcher at the Median Group on technology forecasting, along with the prior mentioned fields. Thanks for making time for the podcast, Jessica. So for starters, who is, and sorry for the bit of the existential question, who is an AI and cog-sci influenced philosopher?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say that I I thought about things like AI and cognitive science, and that's a lot of what I studied in college at Stanford. And I I certainly started out thinking, having philosophical thoughts about things like philosophy of mind, somewhat typical like analytic philosophy topics like epistemology, the problem of induction, philosophy of science, and the mind-body relation, and so on. And I definitely consider this very related to AI and cognitive science because part of it's like understanding how the mind works, and AI is about making models of minds that do things that are useful, and cognitive science is also modeling the mind, and a lot of them use the same some of the same techniques like probabilistic modeling. But I would say that I've branched out in terms of my philosophical interests. Like I think there's a cluster in analytic philosophy that's basically computationalist, that has like certain assumptions like physicalism and treating the universe as a computation and so on. And that's kind of like a set of that's kind of a philosophical framework that's broadly pretty useful. And I think over time I've been more interested in philosophy that's outside this framework. So this includes like for example like reading older stuff like Kant, um, or Spinoza or Plato, and kind of thinking more about like metaphysics. Like I think that the analytic philosophy framework is overall pretty skeptical of metaphysics. It tries to treat things as scientific questions, and I think in terms of like more broad philosophy, some of it's um, how do you even get to the point where you have things like scientific theories? Like what kind of machinery do you already need in place before, instead of just instantly jumping to like the universe as a computer, you're like, okay, but like there's a bunch of steps to get there.
Yeah, yeah. So on the note, though, I've heard Chomsky in a few interviews say that in many ways, well, firstly, he says that science and philosophy historically didn't have this stark separation or the stark delineation that they're completely two different fields. But then he also
Mm,
goes on to say that, and probably he doesn't say this. I've heard some analytical types say that the purpose of philosophy in many ways is to uh, sort of like service science, as in, if you want to study what is, if you want to get ontological questions, then science will do that for us. But and then philosophy is more to, let's say, kind of yeah, assist the scientific process. Would you agree with that take, or do you think we still need philosophy for, as you said, metaphysics or the ontological questions?
mhm. So I think that part of it depends on how you define science. Like if you define science as like the study of things using like experiments and theoretical models and such, then that certainly covers quite a lot. Sometimes when people are thinking of science, they're more narrowly thinking about like theories making testable predictions and going out and testing those predictions. And that certainly can tell you a lot about things, but it's not a complete epistemology. There's a few things that it doesn't have. One of them is reasoning under uncertainty, because sometimes the theory is there, it hasn't been tested, but there's like not really a definitive a test of it, but there's still probabilistic reasoning, such as in Bayesianism, about how likely something is to be true. And I guess things like the room temperature superconductors, an example of that at this stage, it's like we don't really have reliable evidence at this point, so a lot of it's speculation. And at that point, you might need a methodology like Bayesianism, or like more generally statistics to think about like what is likely to be the case. Um, And that's so I think that if you I guess the overall like less wrong Yudkowskian position is like we should actually generalize science with Bayesianism, and then we get a lot more. And I mostly agree with that. But then there's like, okay, but once you have science and Bayesianism, do you need anything else? And I think that there's um, there's a few things that you don't get. One of them is if you care about more things like normative statements, then you can't really get ethics in a straightforward way out of just science and Bayesianism. Um, you also have more like ontological questions, like what is like if you think of a question like consciousness, we might care about something like whether AIs are conscious or whether there's going to be consciousness in the future. But there's not really a good way to just like scientifically define that question at this point. It's kind of pre-paradigmatic. So like at some point things become well defined enough that it is science, it is a field, and then there are methods for studying it. But like there's I would say this is the way that AI is like philosophy, that like there's a certain area that is considered philosophy or natural philosophy until it becomes systematized enough that it's just another form of science. And similarly, in AI, there's study of a certain way of doing things until it's systematized enough that it's just called search or like probability theory or something like that.
Yeah, I have a so I heard in fact this was told by, are you familiar with the YouTube channel Theories of Everything by Kurt Mangle? He
Mm,
so he's
no,
it's a
I'm not.
channel, but he made a interesting point, in fact, in a debate with Neil deGrasse Tyson, where they were debating the utility of science. And I'm kind of keen to hear sorry, the utility of philosophy. I'm kind of keen to hear what your thoughts on this kind of statement. So I'm paraphrasing him. He says that in many ways, philosophy will always be kind of like an outside discipline, because whatever question or problem philosophy introduces, eventually, if it's something worth exploring, it becomes its own very niche academic discipline. So, in the sense that, would you say, how can I phrase this? Would you say the purpose of philosophy is more than more than finding, let's say, answers or solutions? It's rather putting forward putting forward problems and questions.
Yeah, I would say that putting forward problems and questions is a major part of philosophy. There's still some that are unsolved. Like I would think of decision theory as an unsolved philosophical problem where there's this idea that we're making choices among some set of alternatives. And there's also an argument that physics is basically mechanistic, even if it's stochastic. The random events are basically lawful. And so this leads to the free will versus determinism paradox. And I think that problems like this still don't have a solution. And I think things like this can be fruitful for science. Um, and like certainly a lot of scientists have been interested in philosophy. And I believe that Einstein's theory of relativity was in part inspired by Kant,
Correct.
for example. And so I think that shows that philosophy can raise questions and provide some ways of thinking about questions that can sometimes, in some cases, be answered by science, but are fruitful for raising the question in the first place.
Sure. So on the note, Jessica, what do you think? This is more of like a practical question, but I've always been curious, given that I'm just a software engineer. I have no background in philosophy or in any way the way kind of what you do. But what do you think are the main misconceptions that, let's say, engineers and scientists have about philosophers? Not at like a personal level. I mean more in the practice or the discipline of what philosophers do on a daily basis. What do you think are the main misconceptions that have, let's say, if they aren't that philosophically minded?
Hmm. And so I think when I think about it, philosophy is somewhat varied. So people could think philosophy works a certain way when actually only certain parts of philosophy work a certain way. Like for example, someone could think that philosophers spend a lot of time reading the classics, but only some philosophers do. other philosophers work on more narrower questions. And on the other hand, someone could think of that philosophy is about puzzling over various metaphysical questions like the meaning of life or free will. And certainly some philosophers do that, but other philosophers do something more like historical study or political philosophy, which is often pretty different. I think it's common to see the view that that like a lot of these questions are already solved by science or that scientific methods will work. And um, I think I think I don't want to dismiss that too much. Like I think it's easy to dismiss a lot of these things like scientism or like optimism about it, but also the methods of science can be used to study a number of these questions. Like with things like anthropic theories, for example, you could certainly ask like how do I test whether whether we're anthropically selected according to this theory or that theory. It seems like in some cases, science might actually be a better methodology for approaching these questions than what's used in philosophy. It certainly sharpens a certain kind of technical thinking discipline. Um, uh, and but I think it's still easy to be too optimistic about like well about how much you can actually observe. There's certain things that are very hard to observe, and one of them is in the domain of AGI because um, if we create something more intelligent than us, then it's very hard to predict what will happen after that. We don't really get any tests of that. I think there's another thing, which is that I think there's also a misconception about falsifiability, in that there's this common idea that uh, that like theories have to be falsifiable to be meaningful, and people think that Karl Popper said this,
Yeah.
but Karl Popper did not say this. He said the theory has to be falsifiable to be scientific,
And exactly. Yeah.
and he's clear that philosophy is important too, and there's non-falsifiable theories that are important scaffolding for being able to do work. And he was basically a Kantian.
Yeah. I wanna jump to before you get like because I really want to discuss your paper on AI alignment too. But
Mhm.
before that, I'm really curious, and I'm sorry if this is a very kind of like a vague question, but are you familiar with the philosopher? Well, he calls himself doing foundations of physics, Tim Maudlin.
No, I haven't heard of them.
Yeah, so basically he works in a philosophy department, although what his primary works like he's got a background in physics. I think he's got a PhD in physics, and his work is on deriving ontologies of the physical universe based on physics, on
Mhm.
what we know about modern physics. So he calls it the foundations of physics. And then when I was reading your stuff, it got me thinking, is there such a thing as the, let's say, the philosophical foundations of cognitive science and AGI, let's say? Is that something that you'd say researchers are actively working on? Or is that just what we would colloquially call philosophy of mind?
So I think that with uh, cognitive science, a lot of it is founded in things like logic and probability theory. And like there's, for example, the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that the mind approximates Bayesian inference. And there are at least some empirical tests that provide some limited support for this. And there's more generally things like the problem of induction, where there's this open question of how does the mind induce the future from the past.
Yeah.
Like even if there's no logical justification for why the sun will rise tomorrow if it's always risen in the past, human minds will do this, and there's some mechanistic explanation for this. Um, so I think that uh, some of the foundations include these like basic things that are considered like parts of good reasoning, such as um, logic and probability theory. Then there's you mentioned the mind-body problem, and that definitely intersects with neuroscience a lot because there's this methodological assumption that these states of the mind are somehow encoded in the brain. And this is like broadly pretty likely based on current scientific understanding. That like, for example, there aren't if you notice some difference in your mind, you have like n bits in your mental state, then that there have to be at least n bits in your brain state for that to be represented somehow. So I'd say that neuroscience certainly has a philosophy of mind as a foundation in terms of assumptions about how the mind's processing relates to the brain functions.
Understood.
Um,
Sorry, keep going. You were going to
oh,
ask.
you also mentioned the foundations of cognitive science and AI.
AI, yes, yes.
I would say that AI is more founded in something I said before, which is just foundations of correct reasoning, which includes things like logic, probability theory, and induction.
Understood. Yeah, because the one thing I was thinking about was, so for instance, if I kind of expand on that question, like Tim Maudlin, when he says foundations of physics, I feel like that's in a way quite straightforward. It's trying to find kind of the ontological reality of our physical world, the physical universe. But then when it comes to something like AI, or maybe perhaps more specifically cog-sci, it gets a bit hazy because yes, we have cognition and the human subject, but then the question is like, what is human subjectivity? And that's a question, I guess, asked since the beginning of philosophy in some sense, right? And then especially
Mhm.
since like, the Kant and the German idealist, and then that got me thinking: are there really? Do we really have people working in cognitive science that are trying to kind of let's say speculate and derive meaningful uh, foundations of what a human subject is based on cognitive science and AI? So would you say from what you just said that the answer is yes, or is it still more like just focus on the science itself, forget about ontology or philosophy?
Oh, I would say yes. And I think that it might be hard to notice this if you're just looking at papers published, because partially the papers are assuming some amount of background of people in the field already share certain assumptions. And partially also, when people are presenting their findings, they're not trying to look too speculative. Like I think a big thing in science is that you an underspecified part of the scientific method is how do you even come up with these hypotheses in the first place? Like the method says, once you have a hypothesis, you should go out and test it. But how do you come up with the hypothesis? It can be very intuitive. It can come to you in a dream, even. So I think when scientists are presenting their findings, they might have gotten their hypothesis in a certain manner, which might be intuitive or based on kind of philosophical thought, but they're trying to show their finding in a non-speculative manner. Um, but I think certainly I've talked with cognitive scientists and they do tend to speculate about the human subject. So I mentioned the Bayesian brain hypothesis, and according to that hypothesis, perhaps the primary thing that humans are doing is constructing a model of the world based on sense data that is meant to do things such as predict future sense data. And then you can even go from that to think about values and like what are values. And there's things like planning algorithms which might tell you like if I have a certain value that will tend to cause me to take certain actions that will achieve that end. And there's various algorithms that approximate that. And it's very much like that. Like if you're having these sorts of thoughts about what it is like to model the world and to want things and plan towards them, that can certainly influence your own understanding of yourself or other humans as well.
Yeah, what was the algorithm? Just you said penny algorithm? Never heard of it.
Planning, like
Planning.
yeah. So if you, I guess things like reinforcement learning use some form of this.
Sure.
Where like an AlphaGo, it has like an evaluation of board states and some kind of Monte Carlo tree search to search among the game tree. And there's other algorithms like there's like in simpler logical um, problems you can do like back chaining to start from a goal state and ask like what does the state before the goal state look like, and then like what does the state before that look like, and try to get back to your current state.
Understood. Yeah. Okay, I've got a few more questions on cognitive science apropos AI, but I first want to jump to your paper. Well, one of your papers, and then we'll jump back to the more general questions. So It's on AI alignment. This is I had it ready twice because, as you would know, as you said, in fact, we want you expect a certain background on the subjects, and I don't have the background, so I had to like Google a lot of terms and make sense of it. But this is the paper on alignment for advanced machine learning systems. So a quick excerpt from the abstract. You said, as learning systems become increasingly intelligent and autonomous, what design principles can best ensure that their behavior is aligned with the interests of the operators? So that seems like the kind of the question you guys are posing. I even saw that you've done a bit of a talk on this paper. Unfortunately, I couldn't watch it. So yeah, in general, what were you trying to accomplish in this paper, and what would you say are kind of your intimations after, on the topic of alignment for advanced machine learning systems?
Yeah, so I think that there are these basically thought experiments about AI, about like what would an AI with a that was super intelligent do, and the overall AI safety concern is um, since it wants things that we don't want, it's at least implicitly in resource competition with us, and so it might dispossess us of our resources to pursue its objectives.
So
Um,
yeah, you used the example of the paperclip machine, right? Perhaps you could. So how would that example connect to what you just said? Sorry, interrupting.
Yeah. So, for example, if the AI was trying to increase the number of paper clips in the universe to be the highest number, then you could ask, like, what's the most efficient way to do that? So, in the long term, it involves things like turning stars into paperclip factories or raw material for paper clips. But before it gets there, it has to construct like technologies on Earth, like spaceships, to go to those stars and harvest them. And so it it has to find easy access to energy and other resources, and a lot of those are controlled by humans. So, like for example, if you wanted to build spaceships, there are already human factories that are building spaceships, so the AI might want to take those over, and it might also want to take over things like steel production lines because it could use those to produce more rockets, to construct more factories and such. And so it would end up using a lot of land on Earth for various forms of factories or computers. And so humans would end up with not very much land. It might even directly injure or otherwise disempower humans because humans might interfere with it creating paper clips or planning to create paper clips and so on.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a bit of a controversial question. So you've
Uh-huh.
on the abstract, you guys have said we focus on two major technical obstacles to AI alignment: the challenge of specifying the right kind of objective functions, and the challenge of designing AI systems that avoid unintended consequences and undesirable behavior, even in cases where the objective functions does not line up perfectly with the intentions of the designer. On the note,
Mhm.
firstly, just for perhaps this is important for a layperson like myself, how would you explain what AI alignment is without dumbing it down too much? Because I think most people get at like a interior level what that means. And
Mhm.
secondly, as Eliezer Yudkowsky has said, do you believe that, and Max Tegmark is it? A few other researchers in the field have said, do you believe that we can never have fully aligned AI, and therefore we need to hold, which is a controversial part, hold AI development?
Okay. Um, I think that I would say that AI alignment is the study of, in theory, how would we create AI systems that tend to produce effects in the world that are good for us and not bad for us. Um, and as you said, there's multiple areas to this. There's designing the right objective function, and there's um, preventing unintended side effects, even if the objective function isn't exactly right. So if you set a goal like manufacturing paper clips, if you optimize that too much, it's a big problem. But if it optimizes for moderate amount of paper clips without, well, not having too many unintended side effects, that can be basically positive. Because like that's basically what a paperclip factory is. It optimizes, partially optimizes paper clips, but also avoids unintended effects and doesn't optimize it too hard. Um, and part of it's like, can you choose an objective for the AI, which is kind of like the baseline objective, like manufacturing paper clips that's basically beneficial and useful. And then can you can you somehow do something with its planning process so that it avoids having unintended side effects. Um, so I think that a lot of this is like it gets into a lot of philosophical problems, including things like ontology, because you're like, well, what even if we suppose we did care about paper clips, like that's not all we care about. But like if we simplify our values to that, how would you make an AI that manufactures paper clips? And then you get into like, what is a paperclip? Like, is it how does does it have to be made of metal? How does it have to be shapen? What if we discover new physics theories and this notion of metal having a shape is not really well defined because we're not in a 3D space at all. We're in a like 11-dimensional space. Like how do we resolve that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. Well, does that I see what you mean. It's like, but then this paper is more for advanced machine learning systems, right? I feel like
Mhm.
you did that hypothetical example you used, that would be more a question and that let's say an AGI would have. Is that correct? Where you kind of speculate
Yeah,
on the ontology of things of nature.
right, right. So that's definitely. I think some versions of this show up with machine learning because some they tend to have these opaque representations. But it's even like a bit of a stretch to call it a representation because it's not really a model of the world the way that we have a model of the world. Um, so I think that there's important differences between utility maximizing agents and machine learning agents. Um, and I would say that some of the main differences are that machine learning agents tend to have a much shorter time horizon. Like supervised learning, it might do something like predicting the next token or predicting a classification, and that's a very short time horizon. Whereas something like manufacturing paperclips is a very long horizon. Reinforcement learning can get a longer time horizon, but it's still fairly limited. Like if you give it a game, a video game to play, and you only give it a reward when it finishes a whole game, then it's just never going to learn to play the game. You have to find intermediate rewards that it can pursue that that the designer, you the designer believe will aid in it completing the game, not just a reward for completing the game. So whereas hypothetically, if you had a full, like something like a logical specification of physics and a hypercomputer, you could write a program that would do longer term planning and find which world states contain paperclips as long as you can define what that means.
Sure, sure. Okay, so the again the second part of the question, which is the controversial bit. What are your views? Do you think we can ever have fully aligned AGI, or do you think, as Max Stedmark and Eliezer Yudkowsky has said, there should be a sort of a moratorium on AI development, especially given the recent advances with ChatGPT and whatnot?
Yeah, so my guess is that it is in principle possible. And the reason for that is that um, to the extent that we mean something by values, it is something that has a meaning in terms of the brain's cognitive architecture and mental states. We currently don't have a good understanding of the human set of mental algorithms. But if we understood that better, then in principle, it would be possible to figure out like, do we have values? If we don't have values, do we have like what do we have instead? That kind of seems like values. And so the problem of alignment might turn out to be ill-defined if we don't really have values in the way that we attribute them to ourselves. But there would still be some successor question of what do we have instead of values, and what does that imply about how AI should be designed? So I think in the long term, if there was a lot of study of the human mind and no one did anything too dangerous in the meantime, then it would be possible to create an aligned AI. I think the thing is, I I don't think that Eliezer Yudkowsky or Max Tegmark disagree with me about that point. My guess is that they think that we're just really not on track to getting that, and some system that doesn't understand human values, like machine learning system, will destroy the world before then, with enough probability that there should be some kind of pause. And I would say my views on this are pretty complicated. Um, First of all, I I mostly don't think that superhuman AGI is coming soon, like in the next 20 years. I'm definitely a skeptic of like what are called like short AI timelines. Um, and I think that machine learning systems have certain deficiencies that have to do with things like, as I said, the short planning horizon and the lack of a world model in the way that uh, that humans tend to have world models. I think they have a lot of impressive capabilities, but it's certainly possible to find things that they just do very badly at. Um, and so I'm not really worried about things like large language models the way that Eliezer Yudkowsky and Max Tegmark are. I even think that this technology might be relatively safe because there's economic demand for AI, and this is a kind of technology that has fairly predictable performance curves where you put in some amount of computation and training data and you get a certain performance benchmark. And I think some of these are not like in terms of hardware, there's only a limited amount of hardware improvement before you run into nanoscale scale and such. So I think I think my take on this is somewhat complicated, but mostly I don't think that the kind of machine learning systems we have in the near term, especially the ones that are based on scaling, are all that dangerous or all that superhuman intelligent. Um, and I would still say that there's some risk. Like I understand where someone might be like, but even if the chance is 1% of everyone dying, isn't that bad? And I agree, but like I would say even then I'm kind of skeptical that this will help. Like I think just because there's a significant safety concern doesn't mean a particular policy is going to go well.
Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, I think I'm more, and Elias is really good at articulating this. From what I've listened to many of his interviews and like podcasts, it seems he's more concerned with our, let's call it socioeconomic reality, as like with capitalism and whatnot, and how, big private corporations owning these AIs, as to how that'll affect, uh, the existence of our species, so to speak. And I think he makes a good point because, in fact, it's not even a thing about AI per se. It's just how currently our socioeconomic system works with, with these huge corporations pretty much owning, having monopolies on data and whatnot. So it's even a question beyond AI in some sense. When you say like it's more of
Well,
a sociological question.
I agree that there are major sociological questions here, and I definitely think about those. But I do think that Eliezer would think that open source AI is even more dangerous than corporate controlled AI, simply because it's more available.
Yes.
And so I think if he were to imagine like what could possibly work, maybe he would suggest something like shut down AI research basically everywhere except this one island where people work on air gap machines and all the best AI researchers go and work on these air gap machines on this one island. And I think he would think of that as like a relatively good plan to get an aligned AI. Though I don't know if he'd say it's more than 50-50 to work.
Yeah,
Um,
correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, but it seems to me, and I agree with Eliezer that it's like, of course, if it's open source, bad actors will have access to to AI, right? But uh,
mhm.
it seems that in a way, I kind of support his kind of, uh, for lack of a better term, centralized, even elitist way of dealing with AI. But perhaps the problem is that because at the end of the day, these private companies aren't really democratic. They have profit motives, and them owning AI there's a potential for that to lead to something harmful. Whereas if it's something a bit more, I don't know, state owned or owned, that's at least based on a more of a democratic system, it'll at least have a few more what's the word, regulation around it. over just letting private individuals work on this just on their own.
So I think with things like democratic control, it's really unclear how helpful that is, because I think that depends on, like, is to what extent can the average person be well informed about these issues and support good policies for the right reasons. Because the alternative to democratic control is that certain people build AI systems, certain people become well recognized for their opinions on AI, and these decisions are made in a more um, in a on in partly on a corporate basis, but also sometimes on the more of the basis of what academics do. And it seems like the set of people there is um, generally better informed about these issues, although the incentives aren't necessarily good. That's another problem with things like the profit motive. Um, and so I think that the profit motive can lead to near-term deployment of AI products. Like I would say that DeepMind doesn't seem to very much be acting on a profit motive, but OpenAI certainly does at this point. Because OpenAI has released products like ChatGPT that are highly successful.
And
I believe that DeepMind's large language model research is actually superior to OpenAI's. I'm not super confident about that, but my guess is that if they put all their effort into large language models, they could have uh, released something as good as ChatGPT before ChatGPT. But they're more concerned with like more like theoretical AI research and other areas of AI, and so they don't really rush to commercialize products that way.
Okay, that this perfectly brings us to one of your posts, which is selfishness, preference falsification, and AI alignment. And then you
Mm-hmm.
said on that post, and I quote, "Can people who deeply falsify their preferences successfully create an aligned AI? Probably not. I argue probably not." End quote. So, firstly, what do you mean by preference falsification? And then why, in your view, can people that do falsify their preferences not create an aligned AI?
Oh, so I would say that preference falsification is claiming to have a certain preference while not actually having that preference.
From
So a kind of simple example is like someone suggests going to a certain event, and people aren't actually that excited about it, but they're trying to be polite. So like, oh yeah, that sounds good. And like that's a very like simple low level example. Um, I think a somewhat larger scale example is that there's certain areas um, where like due to propaganda or indoctrination or something, people think they're supposed to be in favor of something,
you use that example.
and they might not really be in favor of it. Um, like they might vote differently on a secret ballot as opposed to a an open ballot on a certain set of issues. They might be afraid of talking about a certain set of issues. And so in that case, they're responding to various social pressure or coercion, and they're not really saying what they want so much as what other people expect them to want. And I think that I think this reminds me of in philosophy is that um, Judith Butler cites a basically Lacanian model of human preference and claims that uh, there's this construction of an identity that is usually gendered, and people claim that like certain things follow from those, but actually a lot of this is constructed under coercion,
Yeah.
and so it's actually like a simulation of of having um, behaviors flow from an identity when actually what's going on is that there's coercion to form that sort of simulation. And so there can be this sort of illusion of having certain traits or preferences when it's that might there might not be that might not match the underlying reality to the extent that there is one of human preference. And I think what I'm arguing in that post is that this is overall not a good environment to make an aligned AI in, because when you get to setting the value function, you're like, okay, so what do we have the AI value? And then if people are not saying what they actually want, then they end up replicating something that they don't want. And so it's just, the problem is just kind of just kind of by default not solved.
Okay, so I'm gonna challenge you a bit there. When I was reading this, what I was thinking was, and I'm glad he brought up Lacan, because Lacan famously says that your desire is the desire of the other, right? So in many ways, the way
Mm-hmm.
I read Lacan is that, you know, what we are told, especially in contemporary culture, you know, be your true, authentic self, so on and so on. It's kind of a whole bunch of BS. That generally, so much of what we are is simply our social reality. Just we
Mm-hmm.
express it individually, and I think in many ways, Lacan is right in many ways of how we desire the desire of what our broader social reality desires. So, do you really think we can have uh, institutions, entities, organizations, whatever you may call it, that don't falsify their preferences? Because in my view, it seems even the most, what's the word, the most ethical, virtuous person at the end of the day has to some extent falsify their preferences and still work on, let's say, AI alignment.
So I think it's going to be hard to get it in the short term. Like, I think that people are very much affected by conditioning. In some cases, their values themselves are even modified or like highly obscured or even destroyed by various social processes. And I think I think different philosophers have disagreed on, like, to the extent, like, do we have these like authentic desires underneath this conditioning? And I haven't read that much Foucault, but Foucault argues like, actually, like, our desires are just so modified by power that the search for this original desires, such as sexual desires, is like not actually fruitful. It this like our desires are the thing that interacts with these processes and so on. Whereas someone like Freud would be more likely to say that, in a very straightforward sense, humans have repressed desires. Um, and so there's this broad like psychoanalytic tradition of, can you cause people to better recognize their repressed desires, and which has had some mixed success. I don't think there's a strong verdict on that. I think that in terms of making progress, I think an easier way than just like broadly like like thinking about original desires is thinking about like what is there in society that is causing people to be afraid to say what they want, and can these forms of coercion be identified, and can they be modified somehow to create better incentives? Because this is basically an assumption of things like auction theory, that um, people are incentivized to report their true preferences, and it's even an assumption of things like social choice theory, which is a foundation of democracy, that people can report what sorts of policies they actually prefer, so that the decision weighting process can take these into account. And I think it's going to be hard to get actual perfection on any of this. Like, I think that in terms of discovering human value, we might need to do things like combine sources of information about human values from a variety of different perspectives, and get as undistorted a picture as we can, but also combine multiple images to like kind of correct the flaws in the other ones. I think there's various questions that people can think about in the realm of AI alignment that don't really require understanding their true preferences that well, such as like narrow and mathematical questions. But I think that the overall agenda of alignment, I think, depends on like human preferences. Like that's kind of just in the name, like alignment with human preferences. And I think that it's kind of like a lost purpose if someone is just solving some math problems because they hope that AI is aligned, when they don't really even know what they want, or like they don't have the feeling that what they want is important.
Yeah, and I don't know if I still get what you meant by how it can happen long term. So how do you think we can have, I don't know what the word is, institutions that where, let's say, the majority of people don't falsify their preferences in the long term? Like, how does time become a factor in that, if that makes sense?
Hmm. So I think part of it is that I think a lot of preference falsification equilibria are actually induced by trauma, and children have fewer of these problems.
Mm.
Um, and so there's a question of like, is it possible to raise a new generation without hurting them as badly, so that uh, they can, at least for a longer period of time, act on more of their preferences instead of hiding all their preferences. Um, and like I'm reminded of a friend of mine who went to some kind of um, I guess like perhaps somewhat new agey group where people are talking about, oh, I really want community for healing, and that's the thing that they're into. They're into healing. But then his suggestion was, why don't we focus on like not hurting people in the first place? So they need all this healing.
In the end of that post, you recall a very interesting conversation. So, is it okay if I read a bit of an excerpt from that blog post, right?
Sure.
And then maybe you could give a few of your thoughts. So, here's what you say. You say, I recall the conversation in 2017 where a CFAR, what's CFAR, Jessica?
Center for Applied Rationality.
Oh, understood. Oh, gotcha. So I recall a conversation in 2017 where a CFR employee told someone I knew who was a trans woman that there was a necessary decision between treating the trans woman in question as a woman or as a man, where as a man meant as a moral agent and as a woman meant as a moral patient, someone who's having problems and needs help. The same CFR person later told me about how they are excited by the idea of undoing gender, quote unquote, undoing gender. This turns out to align with the theory I am currently advocating, that it is necessary to consider oneself as both a moral agent and a moral patient simultaneously, which is queer quoted in American 90s culture. Yeah, so just on that excerpt there, what are your thoughts? And especially that last bit where you say, this turns out to align with the theory I'm currently advocating, that it's necessary to consider oneself as both a moral agent and a moral patient simultaneously.
Mm. So I would say that the kind of overall context for this is that I ran into this not just with this person, but someone else commenting that about some implicit attitude of men being moral agents and women being moral patients. And I was like, wait, that seems like a strange theory. Like if you ask some philosophers, like, does moral agency depend on someone's gender? They would be like, no.
Yeah,
And I think the closest you could find might be like perhaps some like Lacanian thing. I haven't read Lacan, so I'm just kind of making stuff up here. But like maybe some kind of Lacanian idea about subjectivity being masculine or something. Um, but it's I think that the main point I'm making there is that if people are assuming this sort of split between different people taking on different roles, um, then like I don't think that actually ends up satisfying people's desires, because that means the people acting are not acting on behalf of themselves, and the people whose preferences are supposedly being acted on don't have the power to do things, except very indirectly. And so there's necessarily going to be misunderstandings there, and like it's harder to empathize with someone who is just fulfilling a very different function or mental state than yourself. And so I think that uh, like I think that the um, I think part of the reason I wrote that is that it's uh, like if I notice that some men in my life think that they can't just act on what they want or express what they want because it's considered feminine, then like that actually seems directly like an obstacle uh, to overcoming preference falsification.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Okay, okay. Okay, this is really interesting because I was gonna ask you before, and I wasn't even sure if I should ask this question because
Mhm,
I thought you were purely an analytical philosopher, and then the more I read
mhm,
your work, I saw you mentioning Foucault, I saw you mentioning psychoanalysis. I was like, oh, great, now I could ask you this. What are your general views on psychoanalysis? And personally, I come more from the continental psychoanalytic tradition. That's where I've
mhm.
kind of done most of my reading. Um, so getting to this conversation, and then what's your general view on psychoanalysis and how it pertains to cognitive science and AI, let's say, and does it have anything to say, anything useful to add to those fields?
Mm. So I would say that there's a kind of conventional scientist attitude of like, isn't this all just nonsense? Like we've come up with better psychological theories since then. We have science. Like, why do we need psychoanalysis? Why are we reading these people from 100 years ago? And I think that's the view I used to hold. I think I think partially I've updated because I think a lot of the I think the overall quality of uh, scientific or experimental psychology is lower than I used to think it was. And I think in popular discourse, this corresponds to things like the replication crisis of like maybe a lot of these things can't actually like whatever we're currently doing that we're calling psychological science is not actually producing very reliable results. Um, and I do have more respect for more like deep thinkers who are more generalists who think about a variety of things using various methodology, not just scientific methodology. And so I haven't actually read very many of these people, but um, broadly, it seems like they have important ideas. It seems like it's probably worth people who are into psychology reading them. Um, I think that yeah, I think some of these have like very like a kind of general psychological concepts that are possible to apply to lots of situations. There's things like the id, the ego, the superego, there and like the idea of repressed desires. There's things like the Lacanian uh, trichotomy between the psychotic, the neurotic, and the pervert. And um, I think that they're they can be pretty useful models for thinking about a variety of things. Um, they're they're not quite at the level of science in the sense that it's like not enough of a theory that you can say like here's exactly what it predicts, here's what would falsify it. um, but I think it's often fruitful to like think of a situation and apply some of these models to it and then at least be able to come up with something like some interpretation of the situation that's like a starting point. um, Even if it's not like therefore my interpretation is correct. It's like therefore I have an interpretation and I can think about like what that implies. Is it at all testable and so on.
Sure, sure. So on the note, Jessica, you had another post called a critical agential account of free will and causation, or free will, causation, and physics. And then you
Mm-hmm,
use so the term agent, it's used across all your work, which makes sense, if you're talking about AI
mm-hmm,
and whatnot. And what are your views? Because in psychoanalysis, we have what we call the subject, right? And the subject is a loaded term, even all the way from Kant, the German idealist, use it. And then subject, it means many things, right? Whereas the term agent, I think, is more apt for conversations around AI and even perhaps cognitive science.
mm-hmm.
So, at, in your view, what differentiates a subject as to how it's used, let's say in psychoanalysis, from an agent of as to how it's used in, let's say, game theory or even AI or cog sci?
Okay, so I would say that I to be clear, I haven't read a lot of the psychoanalysts, but in my mind, a major distinction is that the subject is primarily something like a world model. It's a way of ontologizing the world and determining what is in the world, and some idea of the self and how the self relates to the world. And I definitely think of Kant's philosophy as specifying what a subject is, like the idea of like the a priori space and time isn't objective clock time. It's a kind of subjective timeline in which the sensory phenomena are organized and so on. Whereas I would say that agent is more about it does include a world model, but it especially focuses on action and values. So an agent is capable of doing something, not just perceiving the world. And these actions are often for some purpose. So in game theory, it would be to maximize a utility function. Um, and it and I think in my post on critical gentile metaphysics, it's not so much about optimizing a utility function so much as taking actions so as to do things such as test scientific theories, or operationalize them,
So
instead of simply being like more like a passive observer.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, on the note, in fact, I found you through this post, your post on Less Wrong, a short conceptual explainer of Immanuel Kant's
Mhm.
recent. And at the time, I was reading a lot of Kant, and I was not that I in any way am an expert on this, but I couldn't believe how succinctly you've explained all of Kant's concepts. Because, as you may know, the German idealists and the Kantians in general are notoriously very difficult to read. Uh, so, okay, again, general question. What do you think modern coxi and AI can learn from, uh, let's say, Kant and then the post-Kantians, such as the German idealists, Hegel, Victor Schelling, all of them? Do you think there's anything worthwhile to get from these philosophers, or are they just, artifacts of the past?
So I would say Kant for sure, and I think I can specify that more. So like I do think of Kant as in some ways an AI and cognitive science person before those were much of a thing, because what he's doing is he's saying there's this task of understanding the world in general, which seems like fairly unbounded. But for philosophy specifically, there might be a more bounded thing I can do here, which is determine what is the cognitive machinery that the human subject uses to conceive of the world. And if I can complete this task, then perhaps the general task of understanding the world is mostly just iterations and things following from this, rather um, than like basically having to work out the foundations anew each time. And so when he's thinking about the um, the the subject, there's this notion of the a priori, which is certainly a concept used in cognitive science and AI in terms of Bayesianism. And in the post I give some relationships between those and Bayesian theories. But a lot of it is like what do you have to assume at the start before you even take in data and use those to test theories? Like you have to have some machinery already in place for doing things like organizing perceptions into space and time. um, you can't learn about time without already having time, because learning takes place in time. And so that certainly would, if clarified, that would have implications about AI, because that would say something about what you have to put into an AI at the start in its mind for it to even be able to learn in the first place. So some of his ideas about things like schemata, or like combining a concept such as the cat with your visual field, where you kind of see a splotch of orange and then you're like, oh, it's a cat. That seems to have a lot in common with computer vision, because computer vision is about mapping a concept, like the concept of a cat, to a visual field. And so I wouldn't particularly say that like he knows how to solve a lot of these problems like computer vision, but his work certainly raises a lot of them, and like fairly early on, even before there were computers. So I think in part it might be useful as a sort of reference point of someone in the past thinking about a lot of the questions of how a mind works, and who's been commented on quite a lot by others, even before computers and so on. I would say even more speculatively, there might be things to learn about ontology from Kant,
Good.
in terms of things like defining ontology in terms of things like space-time and sensory fields of phenomena might have utility if you want an AI to have a kind of ontology of the world that you can talk to it in, then you might want it to have something like a 3D model of subjective space-time that is somehow related to your 3D model of subjective space-time, and have something like a common language for specifying um, objects. I mentioned before the problem of even if you wanted a paperclip maximizer, how would you specify a paperclip? And you might want to do it using a sort of Kantian method where you think about um, like like the paperclip in terms of, does it have a location in space-time, and what are its properties in terms of phenomena and like extension and so on.
Sure. Okay. And on this question, speculate as much as you want. This is just a podcast.
Uh-huh.
What are your philosophical intimations on mind as such?
So I think that if we're thinking of what of there's like all the stuff, and then some of the stuff is stuff that we call mind, and then we can ask like what is it about that stuff that makes it mind? And I think a few of those properties are things like inference,
Hmm.
where um, in like we can take incomplete data and form a picture from incomplete data, and this leads to errors in things like optical illusions. And the inference includes both deductive inference and inductive inference or probabilistic inference. Um, and so there's a sense in which physics per se isn't really an inferential process in the same way. It's more like a causal process, where it's not like if there's half a cup, then the cup will automatically form and complete itself because that would be less surprising. Whereas the mind will see half a cup and then complete it to a full cup. Um, so I think that there's inference. I guess there's also memory, and the memory is that a current context relates to past contexts. And in physics, in a direct way, the present context relates to some context immediately in the past, and that like in a dynamical system, the present states follow from the past states, but they don't really relate to the distant past in the same way. And so the memory of the mind has something kind of like a freezing effect, where the past um, can influence the future in some way. And of course, some of this could be implemented in terms of a physical machine. But if we're conceiving it as mental, we're conceiving it as relating the present to the past. Yeah, I can't really say that I've named all the properties of mind. I
Oh,
guess
of
one
course
more
not.
is
I wasn't expecting you.
yeah,
Sorry. I just meant just,
yeah,
speculate. Yeah, just your
sure. And I,
intimations.
I think I think a lot of it is you can think of immediate context, like we're having a conversation and there's like we're probably looking at things, and there's the things that are kind of more immediate context I would generally classify as more mental. Whereas if you think about like what is physics, like when you get down to the lowest level, it's some kind of very confusing quantum thing. And in order to get to relate it to mind, which is like a kind of more immediate thing, there's all these levels of ontology that are in between the quantum mechanical level and the sense experience. Um, and so I think of in my post on critical agentism and my more recent post on consciousness, I think I take the view that a lot of how if we're starting out trying to understand consciousness or mind, um, we might actually have to do something like think about how a mind can construct a view of physics and relate itself to that physics, as opposed to assuming that physics is fixed and we're trying to look for minds within the already fixed physics in some sort of view from nowhere. It's like we got to that physics from some perspective and iterating some sort of process.
Interesting. So if you could elaborate on that, Jessica, would that be you're saying in the quote unquote objective study of physics also consider the subject, the mind that's involved in it when in the methodology, let's say?
Yeah, especially if we're trying to discover things about consciousness or the mind. I think that if we're just interested in like where are the atoms, then we might not need to pay that much attention to that, although it still might help. Um, but I think a thing a lot of people are worried about is that if you just go into physics and you say, okay, ignore mental states, just focus on the atoms and measuring the atoms, we end up with the picture that's like, okay, we tracked all the positions of atoms, we have perfect knowledge, we know everything. But then
What
I'm like, but where am I? And like, what are my values? Where's ethics? And they're like, don't worry about all that. um, and so I think that if we don't want to just end up with that kind of view and we want to learn about the other things, then we have to study the relation of these other things to the scientific process instead of like forgetting them and just focusing on the things. Like, for example, if we want to understand ethics better, we might have to think about um, like you can in part study ethics by thinking about what kind of processes are in place for science to work. So that includes things like people aren't supposed to publish fraudulent papers, and people are supposed to check claims themselves. And if the claim is false, then they report on that claim. And there's a lot of things that could be called scientific ethics that you couldn't really get to the low-level scientific picture of atoms without. Um, and so if we look at the process of science and pay attention to the ethical or personal aspects of it, um, then we aren't going to end up with this view where like at the end of the day it's all just atoms and like ethics is fake, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we'll see like, oh, okay, it's actually a part of the process.
I see what you mean. Are you familiar with a bit of an ancillary point, but are you familiar with Mark Solms? He's done some work. He's a neuropsychologist. He's done some work with Carl Friston. Um, is very interesting because uh he essentially has a similar view, and he comes more from a neuroscientific perspective, and he's kind of arrived at this conclusion that we in fact need psychoanalysis and all these uh, quote unquote anachronistic fields and incorporate it into science. And I just thought it was quite interesting because you come more from like an AI, cog sci point of view, and you've arrived at a similar place. Okay, so
Interesting.
yes, all right, Jessica. So this is probably the penultimate question because I'm a bit cognizant of the time. We've got about 20 minutes.
Hmm.
On the topic of mind, I've been curious. Again, what are your intimations on the relationship of language to mind? And perhaps you could even use that question to answer what the relationship between linguistics and cog sci and AI is.
I think that there's one way of studying this is, I think from a cognitive science perspective, you can think about how does the mind do language? And you can think of from various perspectives, like you could think of language as sense data, and understanding language as processing sense data using basically like induction and probability. And that certainly explains certain parts of language use. And then that goes into agency and like why do people utter language? And you could give a sort of decision theoretic view that like language is useful, and by uttering language we accomplish something. And so I would say this is a way of trying to contain language inside cognitive science. But there's other things that could be done as well. Um, like I, I think that there's the so something like the Wittgensteinian view is going to be, say, like a lot of these things that we think about with like metaphysics that seem like philosophical confusions are actually our choices in how we use language. Like something sounds like a very grand idea if we're like metaphysically, what even is free will? But it sounds a bit more mundane and maybe easier to study if we think like what what things ought to be called free will? Like what in terms of use of language, we were making some decision as to what things to call free will. And so some of these things that are metaphysical might be able to be approached as a linguistic thing. And I think that approach has some limitations, but it seems like at least a lot of things that might be considered metaphysics can be analyzed in that way. Um, I think there's also kind of a broader function of like what even is the role of language? Like what makes something language as opposed to something else? And I think a lot of it is the grammatical structure. And this is kind of like the Chomskyan idea of like recursive grammar and languages of thought, which is a common cognitive science idea as well. Like I worked in Noah Goodman's lab, and he certainly thought about things like the language of thought in terms of things like composing probabilistic models of the world with each other, where you're like, there's there's a cat on top of the couch is like a sentence, but each of those words expands into some sort of hypothetical that combines with each other, and so we can imagine all sorts of situations um, with this sort of probabilistic language. And I think generative AI has some properties of this, but doesn't satisfy all properties of this. Like you can ask an image generator, like draw a cat on top of a couch, and it might or might not get it right. But if you give it like 3 layers of recursion, it's just definitely not going to get it. So I'd say there's still parts of language that aren't really solved in AI. Um, Trying to think of whether I have anything else to say. Oh, right. So I think another thing is that with the language metaphysics relation, there's there's kind of this question of like when we're talking about physics or metaphysics or anything else, we are using language, and so the structure of our theories has to match the structure of language. And this is kind of a on the one hand, it might be considered a kind of like limitation of our ability to understand or talk about anything is it has to be in the structure of language, but there's also a way of thinking about it as there's uh, like however the world is as soon as we any way we could understand it will end up in language, and so the the there's a way of kind of just assuming that the structure of the world is a linguistic structure. And I think Chris Langren's cognitive theoretic model of the universe is basically taking this approach. um, I briefly read the theory. I don't understand it in detail, and it's like kind of galaxy brained. But the way he's going is
The
he's
guy with
saying
the
like
high IQ. Chris,
hmm?
the guy with the high IQ, right?
Yeah, the high IQ guy.
Yeah.
You have to have a very high IQ to understand the
I
cognitive
understand
theoretic
this.
model.
I tried to read just a Medium post on it, and man, you're right. It's out there. Yeah. Anyway, sorry for the interruption. Just keep going.
Mhm. Um, yeah, it's like is I guess it raises the question of how far you can you go with like saying the structures of the world as we understand them are linguistic structures. Like science is a language, math is a language, philosophy is a language, and so on.
Yeah. In fact, so it's interesting. Heidegger, he said that language is the house of being, and then Lacan, in his typical fashion, said that no, language is the prison of being, in the sense that we're imprisoned by language in some sense. We can't really step outside of it. I don't know what your views on that are. Just in general, do you think, okay, let's say on the topic of mind and subjectivity, do you think a mind as we know of it can exist without language?
So I think yeah that's a hard question because there are possible so there are animals that don't have language but certainly have a lot of cognitive functions, and so they might even have probabilistic reasoning but not language. And so I think mechanically a lot of these things are possible. And also it's possible to do things like have a like non-symbolic experience or like things that are very hard to describe or experiences in which one is not experiencing language if meditating or something. Um, and then one can describe it afterwards using language, and that's kind of how it ends up in the discourse. But the experience itself might not be linguistic per se, but it's probably still affected by language. Um, like I think my guess is that there's certain cognitive functions that don't depend on language, and a lot of cognitive functions that do. And so you get certain parts of a mind without language, but not all of them. And also any kind of first personal thing that ends up in the discourse about mind is going to be somehow processing some mental thing into language. And so there's kind of like an inherent limitation in terms of what kind of mental things can even be talked about.
I see what you mean. Okay, the last question, and just again, this is again related to a mind and well, perhaps even language. What are your views on embodied cognition? So, people like John Vervaeke, he talks a lot about 4E cognition and whatnot, so like what is the model? I think the 4E cognition is, talks about, I think, propositional, procedural, and different ways that we interact with the world. But I'm just curious to hear just your thoughts on mind and how we cognize the world and how it relates to the fact that we are physical beings and we're physical beings in a physical universe with a body.
So I think that there's at least some forms of embodied cognition that are fairly direct. There's things like um, maybe like either like eating something or taking some sort of psychoactive substance or something certainly causes difference in mental states, and that's kind of a direct mind-body connection. Also, things like yoga can induce mental states. Um, and I think that there's another there's also the study of practice within a given field where, for example, if you think about math, like some math is just done by thinking, but some math is done on a whiteboard. And so the way that mathematicians use whiteboards is going to affect how they do math. And I imagine that someone who had some sort of disability of not being able to use a whiteboard might do math differently because of that. And so I think that a lot of these things is like in the process of what we might think of as like thinking or cognition, there's use of the external environment in order to do that work, which includes the social environment. Um, and so I wouldn't go as far to say that it's necessary to do that, because I think that even if you're like just sitting alone having thoughts, that's still a thing. But certainly a great deal of thought involves the external world and taking action. And I would also say that the critical gentile theory I laid out is in many ways an embodied theory, in that it connects the theories of science to actions which might test those theories. And it says that the theories are related to the actions you have available to test them. And so things like acquiring more measurement instruments can actually expand the range of theories and like what the theory can even talk about.
I see what you mean. So would you argue that, if you take the kind of the almost conventional brain in a vat thought experiment, the philosophical experiment, where we wouldn't have the same experiences that we'd have if we were only a brain in a vat, wired up to a computer or something, simulating our external world? You would argue that for us to experience the world that as such as we do right now, we require a physical body and even a social reality in some sense.
So my guess is if the simulation is good enough that it simulates having a body, then basically the same cognitions would happen. And you would certainly observe the same behavior from a brain in a vat who believes itself to be a human with a body in a good simulation, as you would observe in an actual human. There's this additional question of consciousness. And I think broadly my view on consciousness is that computers can be conscious, that it doesn't depend whether it's like a system of neurons or silicon. And it's kind of confusing because it raises questions like, how does each individual operation in the silicon computer chip is fairly small, so like how can that actually add up to consciousness? But I think that problem, I still think it does add up to consciousness, and I'm not sure of all the details. But Yeah. I would say that the alternative to this theory is some kind of view that the that being is has a physical component, and there's a sense in which our measure, or like our like subjective probability, corresponds to some sort of more physical uh, implementation, and not just a certain pattern of computation. And I'd say I wouldn't necessarily buy into any of these theories at this moment. It's a thing I think about occasionally, but I wouldn't say I have a anything like a well-specified alternative to the broadly functionalist view that like a simulation uh, of a mind would in general be conscious.
Yeah. Sorry, I know I said the previous question was the last one, but just one last question, and then
Mhm.
we'll, because we've got about 5 minutes left. Okay, okay, what are your views then? Do you think an AGI is possible without a body?
So I think it's complicated. I think it needs actuators to
What do you
do
mean by
things in the world. Well, it has to be able to decide to do things that cause changes in the world. Like I think it's hard. You can do a lot of things by just reading the internet and having no actual action in the world. But I think that's still fairly limited, because if you have some new idea, you can't really go test a new idea. You have to just wait for data to come in passively.
Sure.
Um, so I think it needs actuation, and there's a question of like what form does that take? Like certainly a robot would be the sort of actuator that humans would have, and so that's probably sufficient for an AGI if it's a good enough robot body. But there's also like could an AI exist on the internet, and then its actuator could be doing things like looking up web URLs or typing things into forms. And there doesn't seem to be an inherent reason why that wouldn't work. Like if you had a very smart machine that understood the entire contents of the internet and did a bunch of inference to learn about the real world, and the way it acted was by doing things like web URLs or web forms, that seems like it could be quite powerful. I do think that it would lack, it might by default, without a lot of understanding, lack a certain understanding of what it's reading, because the text that we form on the internet is produced by an embodied process um, that involves a physical world. And so it would have to do quite a lot of work to kind of extrapolate that out of what it's seeing. And additionally, that might lead to having problems with communicating with the AI, and especially if we're doing something like value specification, because our own concepts about the world are basically embodied concepts. Um, like for example, if you think of a chair, like what is a chair? It's a thing you can sit in. Is kind of a short answer. And it's not so much about its physical dimensions as its utility. And so I think to be able to do things like teach values to the AI or specify goals, we might need to have it at least understand an embodied ontology, whether it has a robot body of its own or not.
Ah, I see what you mean. At least it's gonna know what it's like to have a body. Have
Yeah,
a perfect. Thank you for your time, Jessica. It was great. It was a very enlightening conversation.
this
Uh,
is good. It's,
yeah, I really, really do appreciate it. The fact that you're such a erudite and wide-ranging thinker, I find it a bit hard to initially know, like, figure out how to approach this conversation. But then I realized the best way to do it is to just try to connect all of your ideas and try to build something coherent. But once again, thank you so much for your time. I'm very grateful.